Hello and welcome to this look into globalization and culture. In this lecture, we're going to talk about the difference between popular and folk culture with the emphasis in this lecture on folk culture. We'll also touch on material versus non-material culture and see how to distinguish between these two. Basically, popular culture is mainstream culture. It's our behavior that is shared by the majority of people. We think about lifestyles. We think about the clothes we wear, the music we listen to, the TV we watch, the religion we practice, the way that we spend our free time, the way that we recreate. These are all forms of popular culture. Now, most of the people in this class in a Towson University would fall into popular culture, despite there being some small differences among the way people behave, the way they dress, the way they interact with one another. But popular culture, again, mainstream, large number of people, majority of our groups. Folk culture, on the other hand, looks at smaller groups, traditional groups, groups that haven't been affected by diffusion the way that our popular culture groups have. We're going to look at some specific groups when we discuss folk culture. Here's a couple images of the groups that we'll be talking about here in just a moment. When we discuss the difference between material and non-material culture, really what we want to emphasize is that material culture is tangible. It's an object, a physical object. It's a natural resource. It's something that we could hold, that we could touch. Non-material culture looks at our ideas, our beliefs, our values, the way that we socialize or interact with other people, our oral traditions, as far as philosophies or religion go, maybe the diet we prescribe to, the songs we sing that have been passed down. So think about non-material culture not as something you could hold, but something that's internal, something we believe, something that guides our values, our interaction, where material is something we could touch. Now, sometimes we blur the lines a little bit. An example would be religion, where we have physical objects that symbolize religion, such as the Christian cross, right? Sign, symbol, something we could touch, something we could physically interact with. But again, just be familiar with the difference between material and non-material culture. So, folk culture. Folk culture has really three major or primary attributes. One being that our folk culture groups are small, homogeneous groups, meaning that they live a traditional way of life that is shared. Many of the ancestral lines are limited, so we don't mix much with other groups. So again, it's a small, homogeneous group. These groups live in what I emphasize here is relative isolation. That doesn't mean that they're only found in rural areas far from our population centers. Some of these groups, as we'll see, live right in the middle of our major metropolitan areas, but culturally they are isolated from the majority group. And three, these groups are less affected by globalization. As I mentioned previously, diffusion tends to affect our popular culture to a greater extent. So the way that these individuals live isn't really impacted by globalization, and you'll see this in just a minute. But globalization can be a threat to their way of life. Globalization, as it changes the popular culture around these groups, can limit certain opportunities, can limit where these groups can persist if left unchecked. So these are really the three main attributes of a folk culture. Small, homogeneous group. They live in relative isolation. Again, relative meaning they could be close, they could be in proximity to our large groups, but they are not really interacting culturally with our dominant or our popular cultures. And then the third one is they are less affected by globalization. The first group we're going to look at are known as the Amish. Now, the Amish arrived in the United States, or at the time North America, in the 1690s. And this group arrived from Germany. They were an Anabaptist, or a very specific religious group. And today, there's about 340,000 or so of what are known as Old Order Amish. These Amish that practice Ordnung, which is the orders or the way of life that guides their day-to-day living. The Ordnung would be really what separates the Amish from popular culture. When we think about material and non-material forms of culture, the Ordnung is going to say that you dress in a plain manner. You don't adopt technology for your day-to-day living. There have been some exceptions as far as working with the broader community, but in day-to-day living, to support your family, to support your home, you don't adopt technology, modern technology. So the Ordnung is really what defines the material and non-material culture of this folk group. This group lives primarily in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, some parts of New York and Maryland. They're not spread. They don't diffuse too much throughout the United States, but you will find pockets in other parts of the country where Amish or similar groups that maybe split off from the Amish persist. The Amish recognize themselves as Pennsylvania Dutch. They speak a form of German that was really common in the 1850s, much like English transformed over the last 170 years, so too is German. But the Amish, they speak this language that ties back to the mid-19th century. And they consider everyone else that falls outside of their folk group to be English. Again, it doesn't matter if you are of English descent or not. It doesn't even matter if you speak English. But what they recognize is that they are isolated from the world around them that is dominated by English-speaking populations. So whether, again, you have any background that's tied to the United Kingdom or Great Britain, they would consider you English if you fall outside of that Pennsylvania Dutch order. One of the interesting practices within this folk culture is what's known as rumspringa. And rumspringa allows kids, when they turn 18, to leave their order, to go out, to engage in any type of behavior. So a lot of times these kids, it's like an extended spring break for them, where they engage in the globalized popular culture world. And what we find most often is that the kids return to the Amish community following this rumspringa, following this rumspringa, which literally means run around. So the kids are given the opportunity to engage and join popular culture, but what we see is the vast majority of them are actually coming back into the Ordnung, into the Amish order. And when we look at the threats and opportunities for this group, many of the Amish have been displaced from where they had their major population center in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, which is west of Philadelphia. As the Philadelphia metro area has expanded, it's limited where the Amish can live. So a lot of them have sold their farms and they've moved to more remote places. They've also found opportunities, and what you might see now is the commodification of some of the Amish culture. The Amish are known to be excellent builders, and what we found are that Amish-built sheds carry a strong reputation, and you can generally fetch a higher price for an Amish-built shed. In the state of Maryland, the Amish are really dominate the few remaining tobacco farmers, and Amish tobacco is known to be of a higher quality because of the care they take in the farming practice. So this folk culture, which falls outside of the mainstream, does have some opportunities as it commodifies its culture. Reputation for building, right? Same materials that we might use to build another shed, but that Amish culture, that Amish heritage of building provides a stronger monetary value. And again, tobacco, when we have wholesalers and we have our major tobacco companies looking to Maryland to buy tobacco, they often source it from Amish farms because, again, the care the Amish use, the lack of pesticides, the lack of chemicals they're going to use in their farming process. So the Amish, again, a very unique culture that persists today and would fall into that folk culture category. The second group we're going to look at are known as the Gela. And the Gela live in the southeastern part of the United States. There's about 200,000 people today that live in this community, and it extends from northeastern Florida all the way up to about the central coast of North Carolina. You're going to find most of the Gela in South Carolina and Georgia. And this group has a really interesting past. The Gela population traces its ancestry to West Africa, and they arrived in the United States as slaves, and they were working on coastal plantations um, during the 1840s, 1850s, 1860s. When the Civil War ended, many of the plantation owners fled. They said that, we can no longer own slaves, so this property to us has no value. They left. The newly freed slaves took over the land, and they established a nation. They established a broad stretch of land that was inhabited by people of similar backgrounds. The Gela people speak the Geechee language. The Geechee is a Creole that derived from people from West Africa interacting with English-speaking, primarily plantation owners, slave owners. So the language that evolved over time became very distinct, and it became a very strong part of the identity of this area. So the Creole culture evolved. Again, it's a mix of people coming from West Africa, those traditions, those non-material forms of culture passed down, material forms of culture such as these baskets were produced in an icon of this culture. So this group persisted for about 150 years until the early 21st century, when coastal land started to be gobbled up for development. And this was seen as a big threat. The Gela way of life was at risk of going away. So the traditional occupation of sewing these baskets, fishermen, that the fishing industry took hold once the slaves were freed. So these customs, these practices, this knowledge base is at risk of going away. Here you see some of the farmers gathering the reeds to make the baskets. So in the early 2000s, the federal government acknowledged or recognized that this group was at an increasing risk of going away. So the National Park Service, from the Department of the Interior, set aside $10 million to set up a cultural byway to preserve and interpret historic sites, to recognize the value that this group brings to the American fabric. The Gela culture has been able to fight off development pressures, right? A lot of times it's very difficult for a small group like this to turn your back and say, no, we don't want your money. We just want to stay as is. But because of the help from the federal government, they've been able to withstand that displacement and development pressure. Because once the Gela lose their land, they are at risk of losing their entire culture. They're at risk of losing their language, their identity, and going away. Much like we see with the Amish, right? They have succumbed to some of those development pressures by selling their farms for a lot of money. What we don't want to see happen is this Gela nation be displaced or broken up in the near future. So the Amish, like the Gela, reflect folk culture. These small, these small homogeneous groups, they live in relative isolation. The Gela live in more physical isolation than the Amish. Both of these groups don't interact much with the outside world, with the popular culture, and they are less affected by globalization. The practices for both of these groups date back to the mid-1800s. In part two of this lecture, we're going to pick up with our third folk group, a little bit closer to TU, and then we'll look at the commodification of culture.